Okay, so we're starting this tonight, and out of all the questions we could pick, this is probably one of the biggest ones that's out there. Why does God allow bad things to happen? And in the context of the last few days, this question might have come to some of your minds, actually, as you turned on a TV and saw that in New Zealand, 50 people go to 2 different mosques with no expectation of what is ahead, and they never come home. They never come home because someone decides they're going to go in with a gun and shoot them. And these aren't isolated incidents. Life seems to be full of these moments. Teenagers go to an Ariana Grande. If I pronounced that right? Yes, excellent. I'm so up with the modern music in Manchester, and it's the last thing that they do. They go to a concert expecting to enjoy themselves, and they don't go home. Planes crash or go missing. Earthquakes destroy hospitals. Children get mistreated. And in 2011, a tsunami hits Japan, and you're able to watch on your TV screen in comfort the helplessness of people trying to escape a horrifically huge, powerful wave coming towards them. These things we look at and we think, why on earth would God allow something like that to happen? And then there is on top of this the less publicized form of suffering. It doesn't get onto the news, but things like a mother of 2 young girls being diagnosed with cancer and after a valiant fight passing away, and being at the funeral and seeing a heartbroken husband and 2 little girls who've lost their mum. Why does he allow something like that to happen? And it provokes the obvious question, God, if you're there, why do you allow things like that? Why do you do it? Why did you not intervene? And for some people, this is the last nail in the coffin of God for them. He can't be real. Some people believe in God, but they're confused by this. They think that maybe God isn't quite as loving as the Bible says that he is. Why is a very, very honest question. It's a real question. And what these 2 different types of suffering mean is this. This question that's up on the screen has a different feel for different people. So some people haven't experienced tons of suffering up close and personal. And so the question is a little bit more academic and philosophical. It could be you look at natural disasters and you think, why does God not intervene? But it doesn't get close. For others, there are people for whom this question is really, really personal. You've encountered suffering. You've been in the storm. You've asked God to intervene and to do something miraculous. And it's like you faced your own personal tsunami and he didn't do anything. He didn't step in, and you don't get it. You're asking God, where were you in that moment? Maybe you're going through it now and you're asking God, where are you now? Why aren't you intervening? Why aren't you doing something? And so what that means is how we relate to this question tonight is different depending on what we've been through. Some of us, this is a question in our heads. For others, it's up close and personal. And what I'm going to try and do tonight is speak to both. So at some stages, I'll be speaking to your head, and other times speaking to your heart. So, where to begin? Where do we begin with this kind of question? Well, maybe by hearing someone who really sees this as a knockdown objection for God, explaining why they say it. And a few years ago, Stephen Fry was invited onto an Irish TV show to talk about faith. And for him, the whole issue of suffering is a really, really big one. It's the sticking point for God's existence. It's the sticking point for his existence, and if he does exist, whether he is good or not. So watch the screen and watch what the poor interviewer, who probably regretted the question as soon as he asked it, had to then deal with. He's quite eloquent, isn't he? If ever there was an illustration to be careful about who you ask what, that's it. But here's the argument in its essence. An all-loving, all-powerful God can't exist because there's suffering in the world. Essentially saying that because of all the suffering in the world, an all-powerful, all-loving God cannot exist. Because if he was those things, suffering wouldn't happen. That's the argument he's making. So he's saying, if God doesn't deal with suffering, he either is powerful enough to deal with it but not loving enough to, or he's loving enough to deal with it but not powerful enough to. And so he decides at best God is a fiction and at worst a monster. Now, that's kind of what I've got to argue against tonight. But what I'd like you to do for a couple of minutes is to chat to the people around you and just engage with what Stephen Fry just said. So if you were to hear his passionate objection against the existence or the goodness of God, what would you say to him? It might be that you agree with him completely. If so, say that to the people around you. If not, just discuss what you might say to him as a kind of counter-argument, and then we'll kind of bring those together. Does that make sense? Okay, take a few minutes and have a little bit of a chat. Okay, before you get too carried away, and this is where I lose the room every time, try and bring your conversation. I need a bell, don't I? That's exactly what I need. Okay, draw your conversations to a conclusion. What did you come up with? Anyone brave enough to say what they came up with? Kenny?
Well, firstly, his statement that there is a bug that burrows into children's eyes is wrong.
Okay. Getting away from the specifics of that, so why does God allow suffering?
No, I just thought that in making the statements that he did to back up his argument, it was false.
Okay.
He was using misinformation
Okay. But
to prove the fact.
if he'd said a tsunami, though, you wouldn't have been able to deny that.
No.
Okay.
Thinking about it, I think that most of the suffering in the world, not all of the suffering, but a great majority of the suffering in the world is man self-inflicted.
Okay.
Like, for example, the attitude of the person who killed the 50 people in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Or the fact that the tsunami could wipe out lots of people. Probably over time, people have said it would be best to build a tent away from the coast.
Okay.
The man had the choice to build right on the coast, and he did.
Okie doke.
It's not perhaps God doing that, but man not taking steps to protect himself.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
If you think about San Andreas Fault, for example,
Yeah.
Los Angeles is built on it.
Yeah.
San Francisco is built on it.
Okay.
Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
And yet they still let him do it.
Okay. Okay. Let's throw it open to the rest of the room. Andy, what have you got?
Yeah, I would take him to Genesis 1, verses, because when God created the universe, it was perfect.
Okay.
And then we don't know exactly what happened in the heavenly realms, but Satan rebelled and was cast down
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
and tempted Adam and Eve. And as a result of that, sin came into the world.
Okay.
Because all our actions bring consequences.
Yeah. Okay.
And we see that not only, did it affect man, but the earth was cursed as well. So that's why we get all these natural disasters, because the earth is under the curse still.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank.
So we all have to account for our actions. So the natural disasters perhaps we can understand a bit more, but some of the things like the shootings we just, that is a result of someone making the decision to do that.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that's a consequence.
Okay. Consequence of human actions. Any other thoughts on why God allows it? Why does He do it? So we're giving at the minute we've given reasons for why things happen. So we've said people do it, and natural disasters happen. So why does God allow it? Anyone got an answer for that?
My starting point was very similar to Andy's, but I sort of kind of approached it from the opposite angle, and that is that suppose God did intervene on each and every occasion.
Yeah.
What kind of beings would that actually make us?
Okay.
That there were no consequences.
Yeah.
We had no freedom of action, thought.
Okay.
We would be fundamentally different beings.
Okay.
From the being.
So He respects our free will. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts in the room? Mark.
Talked about through things which happen enables God to empower us to show God's glory to people.
Okay. So He has a purpose in it.
The difficulty though, I have as well, is that on this side of heaven, we don't understand His plan.
No. No.
He empowers us to be able to show His glory to other people, because He has a plan which we are not part of.
Yeah.
Although, willingly sacrificing ourselves to His plan, wanting us to do what He wants us to do,
Yeah.
just to extend, compassion to people. Who are we to know that might lead to them actually completely?
Yeah. So He's got a plan behind it that we can't see. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments in the room, or is that pretty much sum up where everyone else got? Derek.
On Stephen Fry's views,
Yeah.
we are probably all believers in here. So we would obviously have the opposite view that if we were not believers, we'd probably have the same view as he's got.
Yeah. Yeah. We might do.
We would think, how's all this happening?
Yeah.
We're not a
Yeah, it's a good point. Possibly, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. Okay, so let's move on. So on Friday, when I was trying to guess what you might say to that particular question, these are some of the things that I came up with that are about to appear on the screen. So things like free will, some of you say it's the devil did it, that it's a fallen world and it's just the natural consequences. None of you went with punishment. I thought possibly if people believe in karma and all that sort of stuff, they might think people are getting what they deserve. You didn't go anywhere near that. So, how do these things stack up when we place them next to the Bible? Actually, do they give a knockdown answer for why God allows suffering to occur? So, maybe some of them do, but none of them do it perfectly. So, let's look at the free will one to start with. If we say that God gives us free will and he won't interfere with our decisions, and it's because it's such a high value to him, what about the times in the Bible where God actually stops someone exercising their free will? So they're going to do something bad and God steps in and stops them. So 2 big examples. The Apostle Paul, he has got this massive plan where he is going to go around and he's going to get Christians and he's going to throw them in prison and he's going to vote for them to get executed. God interferes with his free will. Interferes with him. He knocks him off his horse, he blinds him, and he turns his life around. It seems that the Apostle Paul's free will wasn't as important to God as knocking Paul off his horse and stopping suffering. So at times, God doesn't care about our free will. He will intervene. Another example from the Old Testament, because Paul's not an isolated case, there's a guy called Balaam who's hidden in the book of Numbers. He gets recruited by Israel's enemies to curse them for a bundle of cash. And because he's known for being someone who could do that kind of thing. He learns from God that Israel's blessed by God, but hey-ho, he likes money, and he decides he's going to do it anyway. So he travels, he's fully intending to do it, and first God meets him and says, you do this and I'll end you. And then, when he still tries to do it and he still tries to speak, God intervenes, and he can't even say the words he wants to say. So maybe free will isn't the knockdown answer that we think it is. If God intervenes in these 2 occasions to stop suffering, why can't he do it elsewhere? You didn't go for this one, but what about God about using suffering to express his displeasure at people? Because again, that's something that happens in the Bible, but it's not clear that it's every single time. So you can look at instance in the Bible and say, you know what, God's patience came to an end with certain people and certain nations, and he made someone else rise up to take them out. That caused suffering. God did that. We can say actions have consequences. We can say if you keep doing something, like if you go to Greg's and eat donuts every day, it has an effect on you. Suffering can be the consequences of our actions, but it doesn't happen. It's not for certain that every single time that's the reason. In the book of Luke, there's a place where Jesus is being asked about some people he talks about some people who died when a tower collapsed. So 18 people are killed in a tower collapse. And he says to the people who are listening, do you think they were worse sinners than anyone else? No, he says they weren't. So things just happen. Things just seem to happen. Is it part of just living in a fallen world? Is it part of living in a world where God has retreated to a safe distance and set things off and things happen? Well, it's tricky again, because if you read your Bibles, God controls events. Why does it rain? Why does it rain? We can say it's the water cycle, but the Bible would teach us he makes it rain. So both things happen at the same time. We're told God sets up kings and he deposes them. So the ruler of North Korea, God's put him in place and he's a horrific man. God put Theresa May in place and we might question the wisdom of that decision. If God controls all events like this, why doesn't he intervene in suffering? And even if you go to the position of saying, well, the devil did it because there's a devil in the world, the book of Job would say to us, yes, the devil can do things, but only so far as God lets him. So that's one of the whole things in the book of Job. It's you can do certain things, but there's limits. So, is it an unanswerable question? Is the whole question, why does God allow bad things to happen, unanswerable? Because every answer we come up with doesn't fit every example, doesn't fit every single example. And so, what I'm going to try and do for you now is give you some things for your head and then some things for your heart. And to start off with, what I want to say to you is this. If you come to the point where you think suffering disproves God's existence or it makes you doubt his goodness, then what you have to realize is this. Kicking God out of the picture doesn't solve the problem. Stephen Fry on the thing said, you get God out of it and your life is better. But actually, it's not. If you looked at what Stephen Fry was saying, he was saying that there was injustice and there were things that were wrong. There was natural disasters. There was things in nature that were just seemingly wrong. But if you take God out of the picture, you don't have any foundation to be angry at any of those things happening. Take God out of it, your anger at what happens, you don't have any basis for it. So think of the kind of suffering that's caused by injustice. So think slavery, think people trafficking, think oppressive regimes around the world. How do we know that what they do is wrong? How do you know something is wrong? Well, we might say it's just obvious that you shouldn't have slaves. But the question of a 2-year-old comes back. If there's no God, why is it wrong? Why is it wrong to have slaves if there's no God? And what you have to do, you have to then point outside of yourself to some kind of law which just exists, which transcends human beings. So the American Declaration of Independence says, we believe these things to be self-evident that all people are created equal. And that was eventually used to outlaw slavery in the US. But that statement stands on the fact that people are made in God's image. That's why they have value. Otherwise, it's not self-evident that all people are created equal. People are stronger and smarter and taller and better looking and more able-bodied and genetically more robust. This equalness is based on a value which can only come from the Bible, that every human being is created in God's image. Am I equal to Usain Bolt? No. Am I equal to Hugh Jackman, Lorna? No. I could list a whole bunch of men's names that I am not the equal of. Without God, that just doesn't make sense. Life is just a battle. If there's no God, life is just a battle. Strong things survive and weak things die, and it's not right and it's not wrong. So strong nations survive, weak ones die. Amazon takes over, Woolworths disappears. It's not wrong, it's just stuff that happens. Without God in the picture, your existence is ultimately due to being the fastest swimmer at your conception. The strong beat the weak. It's all through nature. Now, we instinctively feel that's wrong. We instinctively feel that's wrong. But without God, you don't have any justification for being angry at anything that happens. In fact, ironically, the very fact that we have this sense built into us might be evidence for God itself, because we have something within us that yearns for something better. That speaks of God. So, you can notice so far I'm not answering the question yet, am I? Have you noticed that so far? So, pushing God out of the picture doesn't make it any easier for you. So, what can we say? Well, I'm going to hopefully give you something to give you the basis of a framework for understanding suffering. And I loved this. This is something a Christian philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, what an awesome name, says. He says, imagine this. You are camping by a lake and you've got your tent set up. And someone next to you says, are there any St. Bernards in your tent? Are there any St. Bernards in your tents? And from where you're sitting, you can look over and you can look in your tent, and because you can see in it, you can say, either yes, there is a St. Bernard sitting in my tent, or no, there's not. Because if there was a St. Bernard in your tent, you would be able to see it. We agreed? Okay. I love this. And then he says, But what about no-see-ums? Are there any no-see-ums in your tent? Now, I confess I had to Google that there could possibly be a fly called a no-see-um, but there is. There is a type of gnat in the USA called a no-see-um, apparently. They are so small that even if you have your tent closed, they fly through the gaps in the fabric and they bite you anyway. Yeah, they're mean. So the answer to that question would be, are there any no-see-ums in your tent? It would be, I don't know, because I can't see them. Exactly. Derek's ahead of it. If there were any in there, you wouldn't be able to see them because you can't see them. Now, when it comes to the question of why does God allow suffering, why could the answer not be more like the no-see-um and not like the St. Bernard? So could it possibly be just because we can't think of a reason why God might have a reason for allowing suffering, does that mean he can't possibly have one? And that, I think, is perhaps did that make sense? Yeah, I got a few expressions, so I'll try and say it again. Just because we can't think of a reason why God allows suffering, does that mean he can't have one? And that's what Stephen Fry can't actually conceive. That there might be a reason an all-powerful, all-knowing God has that he just can't think of. So 2 things so far. 2 things. Getting God out of the picture doesn't help you with suffering. And the second thing, just because you can't see a reason, does that mean God can't have one? Take another couple of minutes, chat to the people around you, and ask yourself if that ask each other, does that help at all? And then ask each other, what have I missed out? Okay, so have another chat for a couple of minutes. Does it help? What have I missed out? Okay, let's bring it back together again. Okay. It's this side of the room that's the trouble. Okay, so I gave you two things to think about. Knocking God out of the picture doesn't help answer the suffering question because it gives you no basis for being angry at it. It's just life. And also, that one that's on the screen at the minute, just because we can't think of a reason for suffering, does that mean God can't possibly have one? Was it helpful? What does it leave out? What did people think? Thank you, Corinne. What did it leave anything unanswered for you?
It leaves out the consequences for innocent victims.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
I think the other thing is Satan is the god of this world.
He's not. God's the God of this world.
But, I mean, he, to the world in its system,
Okay.
okay? It tells us, and it says that Satan goes about as a roaring lion,
Yeah.
deceiving, and that's what he is.
Yeah.
He's a deceiver. So anything that's good, there's no God. But every time there is something bad, then all of a sudden God gets all the blame.
Okay.
And that's the whole system. That's what we don't necessarily see. We've got to remember why sin came into the world.
Yeah.
What caused the sin to come into the world? What was the destruction of sin?
Yeah.
It made separation from God.
But it still doesn't answer Graham's point of what about innocent victims? And even to say that the devil does it, God is still more powerful than the devil, so why doesn't he just squash him? It doesn't answer that question.
But because of sin, then we all suffer the consequences
Yeah.
from sin.
But God could stop it.
He could stop it.
So it doesn't help.
Someday, but he gives man the opportunity to get right
Yeah.
and have the consequences of sin taken away.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we don't have all these suffering because of the sin.
I mean, what you're doing, Jan, is you're explaining why there is suffering, but not answering the why does God allow it part. You're explaining it, and explaining it really well, but not saying why God might allow it, I don't think. Yeah. I don't think they would. If everything was perfect and you could encounter God perfectly, why wouldn't you want to talk to him? Yeah. 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 Yeah, but then you have to say heaven is going to be a place with no suffering. We're not then going to say, I'm bored of you now, God. We're not going to get to that point. So, yeah. Okay, so, Kenny.
It's Pam.
Okay.
Pam came up with a really good analogy that it might explain the St. Bernard and the no season.
Yeah.
It's like we are God's toddlers.
Yeah.
And who hasn't had a toddler wait? Why is it like that? Why is
Yeah.
it? Tell me why. What's that? Tell me about this. Why? Why did you start? And you always have that idea. You're going to be a good parent. You won't explain anything. And then about 40.
I know this.
Because I said so, okay.
Preach that. Yeah, I know that. It could, maybe with God we just have to be a toddler and accept that he knows what he's doing. Okay, so last section. With all of the things that we've said in place already, I'm going to give you some might be reasons as to why God allows suffering. They're not definitive ones. A definitely not reason. So a definitely not reason for why he allows suffering. And something to hold on to when you are suffering. So this is more for the heart. What's been said so far is for the head, this is for the heart. So the might be's. The Bible teaches us that God can use suffering to discipline and strengthen his people. So in the book of Hebrews it says those words, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. However, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. So God might use suffering that we go through to discipline us and refine us and shape us. The Apostle Paul talks about a thorn he had in his flesh, which was something which tormented him, and he suffered because of it. And it doesn't draw him away from God. God doesn't remove it from him. It makes him seek after God more. Sometimes the suffering we go through, God uses it to draw us to himself. The example from Luke 12, where the tower falls on people, sometimes a disaster is used by God to make us suddenly think we are finite and we need to seek his forgiveness. Sometimes he does that. Sometimes God uses it to bring us to himself. And I guess some of us in the room could testify to that. I know from my youngest years, from when I was about 9 or 10 till my 20s, I struggled with anxiety and depression at various times. God used that to bring me to himself. Do I want to go through it again? No, not for 1 second. But I look back on it now and say, I suffered, but it was good for me. Sometimes God does that. So there are some might be reasons. There's also the definitely not reason. Let's go for the definitely not. Now, the Christian faith is the only one that conceives of a God who suffers. So Allah does not suffer. Buddhism doesn't have any concept of a God who suffers. Hinduism doesn't have a God who suffers. All these other things say that suffering is either something for mortals or it's something you simply have to endure. Christianity says that God in Jesus Christ suffers. He suffers. And whilst we can't conceive what God's suffering might be like, maybe this might help. Let's try and think of it like this. I'll give you an insight into my day, and it's every single day during the week. So I take our boys to school, and at times, well, pretty much every day, it feels like Groundhog Day, if you know the film. It's the same thing over and over again. The same conversations, the same arguments, every single time. So Noah, on the walk to school, will be jabbering in my ear, barely pausing for breath. The other two will be running ahead of me, disobeying every single thing I say. Yes. And I will just be there longing for the moment when I drop them off at school and I can go and have a cup of tea. I long for that moment. Now, my walk to school, until the midpoint of last year, we used to walk past a tree that was diseased. It didn't have many leaves on it, bark was falling off. It looked really, really sick. And every single day, Noah would talk about that tree, and it got to the stage where there was just one solitary shoot with one leaf, and he would say that tree was suffering and shouldn't someone do something about it. Thankfully, the tree's now been cut down because I was sick of that conversation. Now, it's fair to say that tree was suffering to a degree. If trees suffer, that tree was suffering. Now, I'd like you to compare that to some other examples. Another example from the Todd household. On 2 occasions in the last 2 years, I have returned home to chaos in my back garden, where a baby pigeon has fallen from the nest 2 years running, and it's trying to avoid my cats. And I have 3 boys desperate for me to save the pigeon. Lorna just wanting the boys to just... I think Lorna's rooting for the cat, to be honest. I think. And on both occasions, I have saved the baby pigeon. Yes, thank you. The boys have then gone in, Lorna has gone in, and I'm left with a baby pigeon. And obviously you have to name it, so it's just me and biscuits from that point onwards. And what I have then is a pigeon trying to call its parents, and the parents just ignoring it. And the last time this happened, this particular pigeon could fly, but it couldn't make any noise, and so it couldn't make its parents realize it was there. You should be welling up at this point. And I know this is Suffolk, and you're supposed to just kill the pigeon, but I'm not from Suffolk, so I couldn't do that. So I managed to get it near its nest, but I never saw its parents feed it. I hope it survived. It did disappear. I like to think that it survived. I suspect it didn't. Now, that pigeon and its parents suffered. We'd agree? Agree? Was the pigeon's suffering greater than the tree? Yes, it's a different level of suffering. So the pigeon suffers more than the tree. Now, if we were then to compare this to a human being and a human being suffering, so the example I gave earlier of the husband who watches his wife die and there's 2 little girls, which is a real example which we've encountered, the fight that she goes through and the suffering that family goes through is magnitudes higher than the pigeon. Those pigeon parents did not care. That family cares. Those children care. They get to see where the suffering is going. They see it unfolding before it unfolds. So the human being's suffering is greater than a pigeon's, which is greater than a tree's. With me so far? Okay, excellent. So what happens when God comes onto earth? What's his suffering like? When Jesus walks on the earth and he becomes vulnerable, what level of magnitude is his suffering? If God is stepping into history, and he should always be worshipped and he should always be praised by everyone, every time he's not given the praise he deserves, he suffers. Every moment Jesus walked the earth, he suffered. When he experiences injustice, he suffers. When he's rejected, he suffers. When he's lynched, he suffered. When he's betrayed, he's suffering. When he's beaten, he suffers. When a father loses his only son on the cross, God suffers. So what we can say about God's suffering is, our suffering is bad. When Jesus walked the earth, God's suffering was worse. God's suffering was worse. It's the world record of suffering. If you go to the cross and you look at that and you think, at that point, Jesus steps into our place and he's cut off from his Father for the first time ever and experiences all of God's anger and all of God's wrath. That's the worst suffering there could possibly be. And he does it for our good. So how does that help us answer the question, why does God let bad things happen? Well, it says to us this: if God can use the world record of suffering for ultimate good, he can use ours too. He can use ours too. It says to us, whilst we might not be able to understand why God lets us go through the things we go through, we know what the reason isn't. It isn't because he doesn't love us, and it isn't because he doesn't care. He experienced the worst suffering anyone could ever go through to find you. God found a way to end evil without ending you. And so whilst we can't say for certain why God allows specific things to happen to specific people, we can say we know it's not because he doesn't love us, and it's not because he doesn't care. So that's the definitely not reason. And that's probably the one to take home, actually. When you do suffer, it's not because God doesn't love you. It's not because he doesn't care. And then the last one, the thing which you hold on to when you do suffer. I've got a pastor that I love to listen to. He's an American called Tim Keller, and this is something to hold on to. So when you feel like you're climbing and you're holding on by your fingertips to God, this is something to hold on to. He gives an illustration of what God will do with suffering in the future, because the book of Revelation says one day God will wipe every tear away from our eye. What's that like? What does it mean to say God will wipe all of our tears away? Well, he says this, that one night, after arguing with his children, which us parents all do, and Pam demonstrated brilliantly with the thing about the toddler, he went to sleep and he dreamt that night vividly that all of his family was slaughtered. And he got up and his house was full of the bodies of his wife and his children. And it was such a vivid dream, he wasn't sure whether it was real or not. He then woke up, and in that moment, didn't know whether what he'd just dreamt had happened. And he reached over and felt his wife was still there. And then he went around his house and he found that all his children were still exactly what they were supposed to be. And he says he wept with joy because they were with him. They thought he'd gone nuts. He was weeping with joy because sometimes getting something back that you thought you lost means you hug them a bit more tightly. Getting them back makes having them sweeter. There's a verse in the Bible that says death is going to be swallowed up by victory. Death is going to be swallowed up by victory. When you swallow something, it becomes a part of you. Donuts become a part of you. Cake that you've just eaten becomes a part of you. One day, God will use even the suffering that you go through here to make heaven sweeter. So, in conclusion, can I give you a specific reason why specific suffering happens? No, I can't do that. I can't say exactly why God let someone go into 2 mosques last week. I can't say why he did. But I can give you a framework to understand it. Cutting him out doesn't make it any easier. It just means you're angry with nothing to base it on. It could be God has reasons for letting things happen that we can't even begin to fathom. It could be he's using things to refine you and to discipline you and to wake you up. But whatever his reasons are, it's not because he doesn't care, and it's not because he doesn't love. And actually, one day, if you trust him, even your suffering, he'll turn into joy. So why does he allow bad things to happen? I don't know. But I think we've got something to answer it with. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Graham very meanly said this morning, am I having a question and answer moment? Do I want to do that? Of course you do. Okay. Do we have any nice questions? Ed?
Do we not torment ourselves by looking and seeking for answers that really we should accept that we won't understand this side of heaven, but what we need to do is to understand that Jesus is a baggage handler and he will carry the load if we communicate to him through prayer and action that we need baggage handler.
I think I'm going to say yes to that. Yes. I think we do torment ourselves and we might need to trust. Yeah. Thank you for a nice question. Thank you. Thanks. That's a really good point you made, Ed. Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yeah?
I think there are times when, even co-Christians have been so bad that you lose hope,
Yeah.
that God holds on to you.
Yeah, that's very true. If you didn't hear that, I think it said that sometimes we might lose our hold on God through suffering, but he holds on to us in those moments. That's brilliant. Yeah.
Just to say that I think of all the questions and all the times I've been asked questions in my life about my faith, this is probably the most problematical one and the most
Yeah.
common one. And I've had to struggle with it a lot myself. But in the end, I resolved it myself by saying to myself, well, you know, if God cared so passionately about justice in the world that he was prepared to send Jesus
Yeah.
to die for my sins, then he is somehow going to make all this injustice right. It's
Yeah.
because it's part of his absolute personality. He can do no less than that because that's who he is.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to draw it to a close there. We're going to sing one more song, and then you can continue to talk to one another and talk through these things together.